hosting of this, and we appreciate all who are here to express an interest and participate. We're grateful to have all of you here. So policy and personnel, Joe Biden declared war on American energy production, and the American people have suffered because of it. Since his first day in office, Biden has pursued an agenda focused on choking off the domestic supply of energy through executive orders, new regulations, and rhetoric of his regulators who have made it clear that they want to cut off producers' access to capital and lending. With gas at $5 per gallon, and I have to say, as I'm driving to the airport the other day, I'm passing the gas station I always go to in Gohmert, Arizona, $5.69 a gallon. Ridiculous. Inflation is at nearly 9% year over year. Americans are hurting, poor and middle-class families most of all. But Joe Biden has made clear that, quote, the buck stops literally anywhere else, close quote. That's me quoting. His administration has allied socialists in Congress have blamed Republicans. They've called inflation transitory. They've blamed Vladimir Putin. They blame corporate greed. But with Democrats in charge of the House, Senate, and the White House, the proposed remedies have only made the matter worse. More government, which exacerbates inflation, or more regulation to further choke off supply. So we wanted to have this hearing. And this hearing will examine the policies and rhetoric of the Biden administration that led to rampant inflation and discuss how Republicans in Congress can hold Joe Biden accountable. We have some marvelous witnesses who are here to testify. We have Secretary Rick Perry, former Secretary of the Department of Energy. He's currently the chair for the Center for Energy Independence, America First Policy Institute. Thank you, Secretary Perry, for joining us today. We also have Mr. Stephen Moore, Distinguished Fellow for the Heritage Foundation, Senior Economist for Freedom Works, and we appreciate you being here today, Mr. Moore. We have Ms. Kathleen Sagana, President of the Western Energy Alliance. We appreciate you being here today. And joining us also is Mr. Alex Epstein, President, Center for Industrial Progress, and author of the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And so with that, I'm going to give an opening statement, and then we'll get going. So welcome you to today's hearing. We thank our great witnesses. We thank the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, the President, Mike Howell, Cedric Hall, and everyone else who's contributed to allow us to use this space and have a real conversation. And I thank my fellow members of Congress who have come today. Witnesses will have 5 minutes to deliver their oral testimony, followed by a question and answer period. And we're here today to discuss the issues that matter most to the American people right now: inflation and rising energy prices. Every American sees firsthand the impacts of President Biden's failed economic and energy policies every time they go to the store or fill up their car with gas. Inflation has hit a 40-year high of 8.6%, groceries up 12%, electricity up 12%, and fuel more than 100%. Inflation is now costing American households nationwide an average of $635 every month. Now, the situation is worse in my home state of Arizona, where inflation costs households an extra $733 per month. And Joe Biden has no solutions because he doesn't understand that he and his policies have created the problem. In early 2021, progressive economists like Larry Summers and Jason Furman joined a chorus of Republicans raising the alarm that the so-called American Rescue Plan was too large and risked superheating demand-side inflationary pressures. Democrats also insisted on reducing verification requirements for transfer payment programs authorized under the American Rescue Plan, which resulted in astronomical rates of improper payments. Joe Biden's own OMB, Office of Management and Budget, conservatively estimate that these improper payments total $281 billion in 2021. However, in testimony earlier this year, Rachel Gressler of the Heritage Foundation pointed out that audits by the Department of Labor's Inspector General indicate that improper payment rates are likely higher. Ms. Gressler estimates that $357 billion in unemployment insurance payments were sent to people who are not unemployed. In the same hearing, Linda Miller of Grant Thornton pointed out that at least half of this stolen money went to organized crime syndicates in Russia, China, Nigeria, and Ghana. In March of this year, a report from the Reserve Bank of San Francisco found that the demand-side pressures created by the ARP contributed 3 percentage points to the inflation that our nation is experiencing. And on the supply side, since his first day in office, Joe Biden has pursued an agenda focused on choking off the domestic supply of energy through executive orders, new regulations, and through the rhetoric of his regulators who have made it clear that they want to cut off producers' access to capital and lending. With gas over $5 per gallon and inflation at nearly 9% year over year, we need to hold the Biden administration accountable. His administration and his allied socialists have blamed Republicans. With Democrats in charge of the House, Senate, and the White House, they're the ones who have produced this problem. We're going to hear first today from Secretary Rick Perry, and he was someone who oversaw the nation's energy policies. He's an expert. Those energy policies help lead to robust economic growth. We're grateful to have him here. We'll then hear from Stephen Moore, the founder of Club for Growth, Distinguished Fellow for the Heritage Foundation, who will discuss measures to curb Biden's historic inflation and how our energy production is tied to our economy. We'll then hear from Kathleen Sagama, the president of the Western Energy Alliance. The Alliance engages in public affairs, federal legislative, public lands, environmental and regulatory issues on behalf of oil and natural gas producers in the western United States. And Ms. Sagama will detail how the Biden administration and congressional Democrats have taken a wrecking ball to the Trump administration's energy policies and how that impacts gas prices, inflation, and harms our country. In some states, the price of gasoline has surpassed the federal minimum wage. Finally, we will hear from Alex Epstein, the president of the Center for Industrial Progress and author of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Alex is a renowned expert in energy policies and is a staunch advocate for the use of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. He'll be able to provide his fresh perspectives on why it's important to engage in fossil fuel extraction, production, and exploration. Again, thank you for being here with us today. And now I turn it over to Secretary Perry for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Great. Congressman and members, thank you. Just for the record, I've got the Texas A&M baseball team in the background here. They're playing the the Irish, and they're ahead 3-0. So if I get excited here without any real reason other than being in front of you all, you'll understand why. But so let me just start by saying to all the distinguished members that are there, thank you for your continued efforts to maintain the attention on the supply side energy policy as the American people face record-breaking prices for everyday goods, from gas to groceries. You know, I had the honor to not only be the governor of the greatest state in the nation, but also had the privilege to be able to serve as the energy secretary and chair of the Center of Energy and Environment at the America First Policy Institute, as you mentioned, Congressman Biggs. So, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today on the impacts of the Biden administration's energy policy and the devastating impact on the American people. You know, three important things happened during the Trump administration's leadership. We became the #1 producer of oil and natural gas, allowing us to become a net energy exporter for the first time in 70 years. And for those of you who would assume that those two accomplishments led to an increase in emissions, you'd be wrong. We actually led the world in emissions reduction. It's also important, I think, to understand the impact that it had on the American family. $2,500 a year is what they saved in reduced energy costs, and that's even more impactful for lower income families when you think about it. The Biden administration is, you know, they're taking the opposite approach. They're waging a war on American energy, and they're trying to tax and regulate and spin the United States into prosperity, and it's not going to work. And the evidence of failure is all around us. President Biden's been, he's taken the U.S. from dominance to dependence, and you know, that's reflective of the heavy-handed federal market intervention, the weaponization of climate policies, you know, particularly when it comes to the environment and the social and governments, this ESG standards that they talk about. They're limiting our American energy exploration and production, and they're canceling pipelines and infrastructure projects. This administration is weakening the American energy security, our influence around the world, and our independence. When we talk about America's economic future, the most important thing is to recognize that we already have a proven blueprint for economic success. Embracing the fundamental principles that drove unprecedented growth and prosperity during the Trump administration and set us on a firm foundation for rapid pandemic recovery, low taxes, reform, regulations. I mean, you name it, we were knocking it out of the park, so to speak. America became an energy superpower, and they can once again. Government just needs to get out of the way. And anyway, you know, this isn't rocket science. As Louie and I would say that, you know, this is pretty easy. You just got to have some people in government that understand that the private sector is really the real key here. If government will get out of the way. And anyway, I look forward today to a very important discussion on ESG, energy, security, and growth, which is the mindset that we need to have in returning us to greatness in this country. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Secretary Perry. Appreciate a new definition of ESG. I appreciate that. Now, Mr. Moore, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. I was just about to say that if President Trump were still president today and Rick Perry were still the Secretary of Energy, I believe we could be producing 5 million more barrels a day. 5 million. Now think about that just in terms of what that would mean for our economy. The oil prices right now are somewhere but $110 a barrel. You're talking about $500 million a day. A day this country is losing because of what the Secretary quite correctly called the Biden war on American energy. But I'm going to talk just a little bit about how this inflation happened, because this story needs to be told. And by the way, Republicans are not blameless here. So we made a huge mistake in the beginning of COVID, obviously, in shutting down our economy. Hopefully we will never do that again. I'm happy to see that we have congressmen from Alabama, Texas, Arizona, Florida, South Carolina. You guys did it right. Sorry, Mr. Lamalfa, but no, California did not do it right, and Maryland was okay. But the point is, we should never do this again. And the economic costs of locking down our economy, shutting down our businesses and schools and restaurants, persists today. We have spent, by my estimates, roughly $5 trillion on because of COVID. You have to wonder, by the way, if we had just basically told people we had a dangerous virus out there and people should be very careful about what they're doing and not shut down everything, would we have been much worse off? I think no. But the point is that $5 trillion of spending, now there was $3 trillion that happened, or about $2 trillion that happened while Trump was president. And let's not forget there was $1 trillion in the pipeline that we had passed in the final weeks of President Trump's presidency. So the money was flowing into the economy. We flooded the zone with this cheap dollars. Then Biden comes in and he adds we have the absurd American Recovery Act, which added $1.8 trillion. And then we passed, unfortunately, and many Republicans voted for this, and another absurd $1.2 trillion so-called infrastructure bill, which, as you all know, was really just a Green New Deal bill. And that's $3 trillion on top of that. By the way, I'm going to say something nice about a Democrat, if I may, at this hearing. Thank God for Joe Manchin. He saved this country. Can you imagine how bad our situation would be today if we had passed the $4 trillion Build Back Better bill, which the president is still touting as the solution here? So this is not complicated. As Mr. Perry just put it, this is not, as my son would say, this is not rocket surgery. The fact is that when you pour that much money into the economy, it was all basically paid for by borrowing. And how did the Fed accommodate that borrowing? It basically printed money. That's really simple. So how would that not cause inflation? I mean, the fact that you have 14 Nobel Prize economists, including Paul Krugman, who wrote a long piece in the in the New York Times saying that this would not cause inflation, that's academic and economic malpractice to make those claims. They were wrong, 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 wrong. So we should never listen to those folks again. This inflation is extraordinarily harmful to the economy. Under Donald Trump, one of the things I was proud of, I served as one of the senior economists for Trump, we increased median family income in 4 years, including the COVID year. We increased median family income. That's the exact middle. I'm not talking about rich people. I'm talking about people in the exact middle by $6,000 in real terms in 4 years. If we persist with this inflation rate that we have right now, which is now running at 8.6%, in Biden's first 2 years in office, he will, one more minute, he will erase all of the income gains that we saw in Trump's first 4 years in office. Okay, so very quickly, my last 30 seconds, what do we do about it? I'm just going to throw out 4 ideas and then we'll have time to talk about it. Number one, Congress should immediately index the capital gains tax for inflation. That's not something we had to worry about for the last 25 years because we haven't had any inflation. We've got it now. Indexing capital gains for inflation is a good way to help the stock market. Number two, I would call on Congress to enact an immediate 10 to 15% across the board reduction in government spending, across the board, every agency of government. Number three, you mentioned this, Mr. Biggs, the amount of fraud in these programs is over $400 billion. We need immediate wholesale audits of every government program to see how we can save money. Number four, we need to make the Trump tax cuts permanent because they worked. Oh, and I'm sorry, I had 5. And the fifth is we should call an immediate moratorium on all new regulations. Under Trump, we actually reduced regulations. Biden is massively increasing the one. The SEC rule, by the way, that you're all familiar with, that one single rule will triple the regulatory costs of publicly traded companies.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. And now, Ms. Sagama, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate being here today. So since day one, the Biden administration has pursued a climate change agenda which was meant to constrain American oil and natural gas production and consumption. Obviously, we all know about the Keystone XL pipeline cancellation, followed a week later by the ban on leasing on federal lands and waters. This president has been intent on restricting American oil and gas, period. But a funny thing happened. Climate change policies meant to make energy prices necessarily skyrocket, in the words of President Obama, actually achieved their intentions. Energy prices started to rise last year, and the administration started to really feel the heat last summer. The first reaction was to ask Russia and OPEC to increase their production. The policies meant to overregulate American oil and gas production continued. When Russia and OPEC failed to heed the begging from the administration, we in the American oil and natural gas industry made the case that we would be happy to increase production, but for policies specifically designed to prevent us from doing so. Still, the policies continued, and now we're in a situation of energy poverty in the United States. We actually have people having to make choices about how many gallons of gas to put in their car. Fast forward to February of this year, when Russian tanks rolled across Ukraine and prices jumped even higher. The reality of Europe's and the United States' reliance on the stable sources of reliable 24/7 oil and natural gas became crystal clear. The fallacy of an agenda meant to constrain American energy was exposed. Rather than backing down on those policies purposefully meant to hinder our production, the White House pivoted to blaming my industry. I have to say, though, it's kind of funny. I've never been in this situation. I've been at Western Energy Alliance about 20 years, and I've never seen a situation of high energy prices where we didn't actually get blamed. The American people understand this president doesn't like American oil and gas, and I'm paying too much at the pump, and they're making that connection. So, like Mr. Moore, we have several suggestions for reversing some of these policies. I would agree with the overregulation bit. I think one of the biggest threats right now is that SEC rule, that climate change disclosure rule. It is meant to make the SEC a driver of climate change policy. That's certainly never the intention of Congress. Congress did not give SEC the powers to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, but it hasn't even passed anything that would, there's no law on the books that says we need to transition this economy to zero fossil fuels by 2050. There's nothing that says that you need to report your Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. There's no law requiring that. Yet the SEC is actually putting forth a rule meant to be that driver of climate change policy. So we're seeing that primarily, and this is a trend that has been for the last several years. Some of it was market discipline imposed, and some of it is purely political. But it's very hard for my industry to get financing right now. The decapitalization, the pressure not to lend to our members, certain banks won't lend to oil and natural gas. It is very hard for us to turn around and respond to these high energy prices and increase production to bring them down when we can't get financing, because each well costs multi-millions of dollars. So we're in a situation where we can't get financing, we can't produce more. We can't get, and we're seeing it now in refineries as well. I represent producers, so I'm not really on the refining side, but we have a huge problem with refining capacity down 1.1 million barrels. And so all this nice light sweet crude we're producing from shale really has no place to go. So it's the same thing is happening to refiners. They have been pressured not to invest and to actually change a lot of their capacity. About a third to a half of their capacity has been converted to renewable energy. So we've lost that capacity. We've lost 1.1 million barrels of capacity, and it's not coming back. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak through these issues a little bit more as the session continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, Mr. Epstein, we'll go to you for your opening statement.
Thank you very much for having me. In 2016, I testified in front of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee about how the anti-fossil fuel policies of the Obama-Biden administration would lead to higher energy prices, which would drive higher prices in every area of the global economy, which is exactly what's happened. As an energy expert and a philosopher, an expert on thinking methods, I explained to the senators that the basic mistake of the Obama administration was the failure to, quote, integrate the big picture data, unquote. The Obama administration was ignoring the unique benefits of fossil fuels to the global economy and to global human flourishing. Unfortunately, many of the senators were unwilling to recognize the error in themselves and in the administration. When I tried to get my senator from California, Barbara Boxer, to see that she was ignoring the unique benefits of fossil fuels, she dismissed me with the comment, "I am not asking you anything. I am telling you that all you have to know is you are a philosopher, and I don't appreciate getting lectured by a philosopher," unquote. But had Senator Boxer and the Obama-Biden administration listened to me and others who warned that anti-fossil fuel policies would lead to higher energy costs, which would lead to price inflation throughout the global economy, we wouldn't be experiencing a national and global energy crisis today. Let me be clear, today's energy crisis is very simple, and it was completely preventable. The price of energy, like all prices, is set by supply and demand. For the last 15 years, the global anti-fossil fuel movement, with major leadership by Barack Obama and Joe Biden, has acted aggressively to restrict the supply of fossil fuel energy, which has prevented it from keeping up with growing demand for fossil fuel energy. When fossil fuel supply goes down and fossil fuel demand goes up, fossil fuel energy prices go up. And when energy prices go up, the price of everything goes up. It's really that simple. Consider oil and gasoline prices. There's no physical reason the oil industry can't meet rising demand. The world has hundreds of years worth of oil deposits. There's no technical reason the oil industry can't meet rising demand. It's more capable than ever thanks to amazing technologies like fracking. If there's no physical or technical reason the oil industry can't meet rising demand, what is inhibiting it? Decades of rising restrictions on oil production and transport from anti-oil politicians, including Biden's massive threats to punish oil production going forward. Perhaps the greatest limiter of the supply of oil has been anti-oil politicians' constant threats to severely restrict or even ban oil production going forward. For example, when Joe Biden promises, "I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuel," and then becomes president, many oil investors run for the hills. Is it any wonder that, threatened with punishment, investment in oil and gas has declined dramatically? Between 2011 and 2021, oil and gas exploration investments declined by 50%. Less investment equals less supply equals higher prices. The basic solution to oil and gasoline prices is simple. We need a long-term congressional commitment to liberate domestic oil production. This also applies to the rest of fossil fuel production. Until Congress makes clear that the government will stop threatening and destroying oil production, companies will rightly underinvest in production. More broadly, the basic global solution to the energy crisis is for the global community to reject the anti-fossil fuel movement and reverse all global anti-fossil fuel policies. This includes canceling the Paris Agreement, the policy that is driving the world to rapidly restrict the supply of desperately needed fossil fuels. Don't be afraid that liberating fossil fuels will doom the world to climate catastrophe. As I document in chapters 7 through 9 of my book, Fossil Future, Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less, fossil fuels CO2 emissions have contributed to the warming of the last 170 years, but that warming has been mild and easily masterable, 1 degree Celsius, mostly in the colder parts of the world. And life on Earth thrived when CO2 levels were more than 5 times today's. Fossil fuels have actually made us far safer from climate by providing low-cost energy for the amazing machines that protect us against storms, protect us against extreme temperatures, and alleviate drought. That's why the rate of climate-related disaster deaths from extreme temperatures, droughts, wildfires, storms, and floods, has decreased by 98% over the last century. What we've been told about fossil fuels is exactly backward. We are told that we should be afraid of continuing fossil fuel use because it will make the world unlivable. In fact, fossil fuel use has made the world a better and better place to live, including safer from climate, for the last 2 centuries, and can continue to do so going forward. What will make the world unlivable for more and more people, as we are seeing now tragically, is the attempt to eliminate fossil fuels, which necessarily leads to energy crises and economic crises. The only way out of this crisis is for America and the world to embrace a fossil future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein. And now we're going to go to member questioning. I have Mr. Roy from Texas first, followed by Mr. Gohmert from Texas.
Well, thank you, Chair.
You got to press the skinny one till it's green.
Y'all hear me? There we go. Thank the chairman. Thanks for hosting this. Thanks for Heritage Foundation for hosting this. Thanks for our great witnesses. Governor, I assume that you're at least watching Aggie baseball right now, the 3-0 lead.
Top of the 4th.
Top of the, I knew I could rely on you, sir. Well, it's good to see my former boss and my dear friend from Texas. Look, I'm going to be pretty quick, and just one thing that I think is critically important here as we look at what's going on, and we look at Texas, and the governor knows this better than anybody. Texas is sitting on an ocean of natural resources that the good Lord bestowed upon us, and yet Texas currently is finding itself in the precarious position of, frankly, now increasingly over-reliance on subsidized so-called renewable energy. The question I'd have for the panel is, what can you tell us about the inflationary pressure? I know the governor opened with some of that earlier. The inflationary pressure that we're seeing with respect to that reliance, what's happening because of the subsidies that are going in to prop up so-called renewable energy at the expense of fossil fuels and at the expense of nuclear, and what marginal benefit is that giving us to society when you consider that coal-fired plants, China has about 1,100 of them. The United States has about 250. China is putting out about 1 new coal-fired plant a week. And we, in Texas right now, in our current pipeline, so to speak, of what we're producing for new energy coming online, it's something in the order of 75-ish% or 80% solar, wind, battery, et cetera. and very little in the way of gas-powered and zero nuclear. So that's a general question for the panel. If you just keep it quick, especially, let's start with the economists in the room. Just a quick answer on the inflation front, and then to the governor and Kathleen, and to my friend Alex about what that's doing to our actual ability to produce energy that's reliable for our grid. When you have in Texas, for example, 2 weeks ago, where we had a 17% production out of our wind farms on a windless day.
Just very quickly, you had a total of and Texas ran out of energy, and your electric power supply shut down.
Let's say that again. Texas ran out of energy.
Exactly.
Okay,
That's just what I was going to say. This is not original to me, but somebody said that for Texas to run out of energy is like Alaska running out of ice.
Right.
And so this is. But I was just going to make one quick point and then turn it over to the rest. One of the things that I think is most worrisome right now, and these are state policies, these renewable energy requirements that are being ratcheted up every year. There are now estimates that 20 states could be, including my home state of Illinois, are looking at brownouts and blackouts. I mean, my God, what are we, a third world country that we're running out of electric power? And it's almost entirely attributable to renewable energy mandates.
Kathleen, do you have something on this subject or no? We got to.
Not in particular.
Okay. Governor or Alex, I mean, I'm just trying to get to the heart of, looking at Texas as the model, where, Governor, I know we were working on trying to make sure that Texas was leading into having all available options for energy, but now we've got this subsidized form that is undermining our production of fossil fuels, and we have decreasing amounts of fossil fuel generator nuclear power to be reliable there for baseload capacity, which is causing pressure on the grid in terms of electricity availability and driving prices up. And I wonder if you've got thoughts on that, or Alex, if you do as well.
Yeah. Well, Chip, when we were working on diversifying the Texas power portfolio back in the early 2000s, natural gas had gone to $14 an MCF. We were almost exclusively reliant upon old, inefficient coal plants and natural gas plants, which, and again, at $14 an MCF, you start looking around for some options. Wind was one of those. We were some of the real leaders. Matter of fact, we became the #1 wind producing state in the nation over the next decade. But our goal, I think, our initial goal was to be like, if we could have gotten to 15% of our total portfolio with renewables, we thought that was going to be really hitting the mark. Well, we blew past that, and I think people took their eye off of the base load issue, and I want to make a little bit of a deflection here and talk about what I think the answer in the future is, because that's what this hearing is about. It's not about any mistakes that were made in the past. I mean, that is what it is. What can we do to quickly, or as the most expeditious way that we can, to get base load on our grid, so that when the wind quits blowing and the sun does not shine, you're going to be able to keep the lights on no matter where you live in this country. And the idea that we have loss of power in America today is just crazy, Alex. I mean, your point with fossil fuels are going to be a part of keeping the lights on, and if you 20, carbon free in 2050, or net zero in 2050, that is a death sentence for literally billions of people around the world. And the moral issue here is one that I think we need to talk about. But the way you address it, I think, is permitting has historically been, and regulations, which are one and the same. That's been the real issue, and across the board. Chip, as we talked about, how do you put in place a state governance so that your people can flourish? Well, you don't overtax them, you don't overregulate them, you don't overlitigate them, and you have a skilled workforce, i.e. accountable public schools. Those are the 4 things that you have to do. So if you have regulations in place, the federal government basically has said to America, you're not going to build any more nuclear power, period. not small modular, not anything, because we're going to regulate you into oblivion. Well, I hope when you take over Congress in January, that one of the things that we really look at as a country is how do we streamline the nuclear industry's ability to put these particularly small modular reactors. I think advanced reactors, walk away safe, they're economical now.
Go.
I mean, to me, the real answer is to having regulatory reform where you don't have these, basically the big blockade that says, sorry, you're not going to have nuclear power in the country.
Governor, Governor,
It's, to me, that's the real answer.
thanks for that, Governor.
Are you out of time, Representative Roy? I have a lot to say, but
I'm way past time.
Yeah, we're over time. Hopefully, we'll get back to you on that question, Alex, because I think that's an important question. So I'm going to go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, followed by gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris. Oh, and I'm supposed to announce both of these microphones, the bigger ones are for C-SPAN, the little skinny ones are for amplification. They both need to be pointed at your mouth so they can pick them up. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. We go to Mr. Moore, and I appreciate you correcting that it wasn't the Wall Street Journal that it published Krugman. But when Democrat representative and chairman at the time, John Dingell, was chair of Energy and Commerce Committee, he was an honest, honorable man. And he made clear, I'm not bringing that carbon tax, the cap and trade bill, out of my committee. And he was fired by Pelosi as chairman for saying the truth. That's not only a tax, it's a great big tax. And he had discussed that hurts the people that can least afford it. Could you explain why it is the poor and middle class suffer the most when you run up the price of fuel, gasoline, well, all of the energy that's increased so much in price?
Thank you, sir. And I may actually ask Alex to answer that because that's what his book is all about.
Yeah.
I simply say.
Is that on? There you go.
Is this on?
There you go.
Sorry about that. I'd simply say this, that energy is the master resource, right? Everything that we have is derivative of energy. So it's pretty obvious that when you drive up the cost of energy, whether it's electric power bills or transportation fuels, that makes everything else in the economy more expensive. And so that's a leading cause of these higher inflations. I'll just give you one number and then pass it over to Alex on that. You know, we're now running at about 9% inflation in the economy. By the way, producer prices are running about 11%. So this idea that we peaked out in inflation, I'm not believing that.
And
So-
I'm curious about that because I was paying $1.80-90 a gallon, and now we're paying $5. How is that 9% inflation? I'm having trouble with that.
You know, I'm only laughing because when I do an interview, maybe on Fox or radio, I get the angry emails and tweets from people saying, how dare you say that inflation's 9%? I'm paying 60% more for my gas. I'm paying 70% more for my utilities. I'm paying for a dozen eggs. I'm paying 35. So if you look at the essentials, Congressman, the essential things that people have to buy, you're probably right. The real inflation rate's probably double that.
Okay. Let me ask, and I still want to say Governor Secretary. You know, when you were governor, I'd seen somewhere that we increased the amount of natural gas usage about every year, as I recall, and yet the air quality continued to improve every single year. Isn't that accurate?
Yeah, and Louie, if I could I give a little of my time
Please.
right now
Yeah.
to Alex and ask Alex to talk about cost-effective fossil fuels and why the wealth that they create allow for the technologies that allow for the emission reductions. Alex, would you touch on that, please?
Sure. If Representative Gohmert is okay.
Sure,
that?
please.
I'm happy to talk about that. Okay, so I think I use the term cost effective, and I think it's really important. There are 4 dimensions of cost effective, and right now fossil fuels are the only energy technology that meet them. So to be cost effective is to be affordable, reliable, versatile, and scalable. The first 2 are probably clear, but the third is really important. Versatile means every type of machine, including things like cargo ships and airplanes and really high heat machines that we use for industry that we don't think too much about, that we don't use electricity for these things today because it's not the cost effective way. And then scalable is really important for billions of people in thousands of places. And so we've got a world where the vast majority of people still lack cost effective energy. We have 3 billion people using less electricity than one of our refrigerators uses. We have 1/3 of the world using wood and animal dung. So you've got a situation where you've got one uniquely cost-effective form of energy, namely fossil fuels, that provide 80% of the world's energy and are still growing in a world that desperately needs more energy. So point number 1 is that reducing CO2 emissions should absolutely not be your highest priority. Empowering the world should be your highest priority. And as I mentioned, the more you empower the world, the safer you become from climate, even as your emissions increase, because your ability to master the climate is so high. But also the only way that emissions will get reduced long-term is with truly cost-effective alternatives. And this is part of the reason I'm so big on liberating natural gas, but above all, liberating nuclear, which Governor Perry mentioned. Again, think about it, is China gonna use solar and wind? No, they're using coal to produce solar and wind. Is India? No, everyone is rightly going to use the most cost-effective form of energy. So if your concern is emissions, priority number 1, 2, and 3 has to be liberating the promising low emission alternatives. That's the actual way to get emissions down long-term, if that's what you care about. But unfortunately, the left tends to be anti-fossil fuel, anti-nuclear, and anti-hydro. Also anti-mining, which solar and wind require record amounts of mining. And the root of that, as I explained in Fossil Future, is the goal of that movement is not to advance human flourishing on Earth, it's to eliminate human impact on Earth. And so they have a hostility toward all energy because it involves impact. And so I think that the concern with climate is a sham.
Well, that's an enlightening answer. Appreciate that very much. And with regard to Snowmageddon last year in Texas, people said, see, it's fossil fuels fails. No, there was a 3-year prior report saying you've got to winterize your connections with natural gas, and they spent that money on solar and wind, and we didn't winterize our gas, and that is the reason we didn't have gas.
Yep.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. And now we're going to go to the gentleman. By the way, just for the members of the committee, she is holding the time behind you, so none of the speakers can see it, but you all can see it, so you know. But anyway, we're going to go to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris, followed by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz.
Very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just ask a little, and I'll ask you, Mr. Moore, about the infrastructure bill, because you brought it up. And Kathleen, you'd commented that, you know, the capitalization is not going on in the energy industry that's necessary. For some reason, this administration doesn't consider a pipeline or offshore and onshore drilling platforms as infrastructure. Very interesting for the leading energy producer in the world not to consider that as part of infrastructure, but we don't. And the infrastructure bill, of course, includes billions of dollars for charging stations when you don't have plans to actually increase baseload, production, as though electricity comes out of an outlet in the wall and not from a plant. But how do the infrastructure bill it competes, it sets government in competition for capital dollars and workers with the private sector. And this is what I see in my district is you have businesses that want to expand, can't find a construction worker because they're all working on a government project funded under the infrastructure bill. How do we get away from that? Is it possible? How is that going to delay the private sector growth that's hopefully going to get us back to a growth in median income, for instance?
Well, Congressman, first of all, 90% of the infrastructure in this country is built privately, and that's the most important infrastructure. We do need roads, we need bridges, we need highways. Only, as I recall, I may be wrong on this, I know it was less than 20%, I think it was closer to 15% of that money was for what people want. You know, fill the potholes, widen the highway so we don't have to sit in traffic congestion. I'll just give you one statistic to give you a sense of how the misallocation of resources. We spent more money, Congress did on subsidizing the New York subway system than we did all the money we spent on treatments and therapies for COVID. Now, that is a gigantic misallocation of resources.
Kathleen, if you could just go into how do we get at how do we recapitalize the industry? I mean, is it possible with an administration that wants to eliminate fossil fuels? Do we just need a new administration? Do we need a new direction for the country, or is it possible under the current administration to somehow allow for capitalization of oil exploration and for other fossil fuel exploration?
Well, I don't see this administration backing down on its climate change policies. I just don't see it. We're going to move forward with that SEC rule. I think it's incumbent on industry, perhaps states, to sue, because I think it's very easy to overturn that rule. I shouldn't say easy. It's not going to be easy, but it's on very tenuous legal grounds. So I think it's possible to overturn that rule. But there's something that $120 oil has started to turn even the hardcore black rocks of the world. We are seeing that investment is starting to return to the oil and gas industry, not just because of the high price of oil today, but that there is a shift and there is a recognition that ESG might not be all that it's cracked up to be. I've been kind of surprised over the last couple of months, the press, even just mainstream articles about how ESG is probably not. It's kind of lost its luster when it considers, Chinese production of solar over American-produced oil and natural gas. Of course, Chinese solar being produced by slaves. So I think some of those assumptions. Oh, and Russian oil was fine, or Russian natural gas was fine a few months ago, but ExxonMobil was the bad guy. So I think some of the luster is coming off of ESG, and I think that's a very positive sign.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, and he'll be followed by Mr. Moore, and in the hole, Ms. Boebert.
Joe Manchin for being a stopgap against what would have otherwise been catastrophic spending. I believe if you are in the role you should be in right now, serving on the Federal Reserve, you could be one of those stopgaps to stop the Fed from continuing to blow calls and make bad decisions. What's the right path going forward with the Fed to deal with the inflationary conditions? Because I noticed that wasn't in your 4-point plan.
Well, that's a great question. Can I just make one side point, if I may, about what you were just talking about? You're the United States, you're members of the United States Congress. What you just said about this SEC rule is absolutely true. You make the laws. You make the laws. These people at the SEC do not make the laws. I hope when you take the majority, you start making the laws and start rescinding these crazy rules that are made by nobody elected these people. I mean, it's just outrageous. This is an unconstitutional fourth branch of government. You are the legislative branch. So take your responsibility. I mean, I'm talking about Congress in general. Take your legislative responsibility seriously.
And so, since you're not a philosopher,
okay, sorry. I mean, I had to get that off my chest. You can tell what was your question?
My question is, what should the Fed be doing?
I'm just going to make one quick comment on it. The Fed has been way, way behind on the curve. I'm amazed that a Federal Reserve chairman who allowed our inflation rate to go up to 9% was just reappointed with an 80-20 vote. I mean, that's shocking to me. I mean, if an NFL team goes 2-14, you don't rehire the coach for another 4 years. I'll just say one quick thing on this. I think that the appropriate thing for the Fed to do right now, because obviously they have to pull out some of these trillions of dollars of spending, I want to see the Fed reduce its balance sheet. The Fed balance sheet is now $8 trillion. Rather than raising interest rates, because the mortgage rate has gone from 3 to 6% in 15 months. Why don't they sell off these assets? That would pull inflation down without raising interest rates.
Colorado Governor Jared Polis gave an interview on Friday in which he offered President Biden some advice on inflation. He said the best thing the country could do to reduce inflation is to revive the failed Obama attempted policy of amnesty for the parents of children who have birthright citizenship. I think it's deferred action for the parents of American children. Is a mass amnesty program for millions and millions of Americans a reasonable first step to reduce inflation?
No, I'm not in favor of that, but I do think we do need more immigrant workers in this country, no question about it. We need more people who are willing to work. And one of the mistakes that you all made in Congress, again, I'm talking about Congress in general, was the massive increase in welfare. We have eviscerated. I was here in 1995 when Republicans took over Congress, and we passed 3 times welfare reform, work requirements for welfare. We said, we're going to have a safety net, but we're going to require people to work for it. Bill Clinton vetoed that bill twice. The third time, to his credit, he signed that bill. That was one of the most successful social welfare changes of the last 50 years, welfare reform. Virtually every single element of welfare reform has been eviscerated by Obama and by Biden. I hope, again, when you all take over in January, that you reinstate work requirements for welfare.
When President Biden was in Long Beach recently, he said he described inflation as the Putin tax.
As the what?
The Putin tax.
Yeah.
Is that a fair characterization?
No, 80% of the increase in inflation happened before Putin invaded. Now, yes, it is true that Putin's invasion of Russia, and the reduction in oil supply has increased inflation, but I would say 75 to 80% of this is a result of Biden policies.
And particularly the printing of money and the massive spending, right? I mean, if we get control over the House, we will not have unified control over the government. Joe Biden will be president. Is the best thing we can do to stop this flow of reckless, unending spending? Is there anything more important we can do than just shutting off the spigot?
Well, there's also, look, you have to cut spending, no question about it. And by the way, the people, I talk to people all over the country. They realize that Biden is spending way too much money, but there is a skepticism that when Republicans take over, that you'll do something about that problem.
As Rand Paul
it's a healthy
says,
skepticism.
when
frankly.
Democrats are in charge, the Republicans are the conservative party, and when Republicans are in charge, there is no conservative party. So let's hope we are able to defy that history. I yield back.
And now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore, followed by
Thank you, Mr.
the
Chairman.
gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
I appreciate all the guests being here, and Secretary Perry, I'm an AGR from Auburn, and I understand we got a team in Omaha too, so I'm not sure when we play again, but maybe we'll get by the Aggies. Biden's energy policy has kind of been this. It's been, number one, you kill the Keystone Pipeline. Then you ask OPEC to increase production. You give Russia a green light on Nord Stream 2, and then you buy your solar panels from China. And when I was in Ukraine, meeting with the parliamentarians before the invasion, their concern was our energy policy, Kathleen, what it was going to do and how it was going to embolden Russia to invade Ukraine. And it appears to me that that is sort of part of the driving force that's allowing now the Russian monetary, it seems like the ruble, I guess, is doing really well. So much for the sanctions. But, Stephen, this is more of a question for you. I've been visiting with small business owners, and I've been asking economists around the country. Normally in a recession, as a small business owner, we lay people off. But right now there's a labor market. We've kind of created a vacuum where we've printed government dollars, sending them to people mailboxes, and nobody's showing up to work. So as we as Republicans begin to take over the majority, how do we allow for that soft landing, Stephen? Because they're talking about a recession. Biden's publicly talking about that. We're seeing 9% inflation, as you've talked about. And yet we have a labor force shortage. And it seems to me that the businesses can't lay people off because there's nobody to work. So how do we soft that landing going into this new majority we're supposedly going to have?
Boy, that's a tough question. I mean, how do we make sure that this recession, which by the way, I believe we're in a recession right now. If this economy stopped growing, it just hit a wall in late May. And when you're talking about $7 to $10 trillion in the stock market, that's going to have a negative wealth effect for sure. And then you look at the fact that people can't pay their bills; they're just having a harder and harder time. The reason I mentioned that 9% inflation rate is I didn't get to the second part of that. Wages are growing at 5%. So this is simple math. If month after month after month, people's incomes are growing much more slowly than the inflation rate, they're becoming poorer over time. Joe Biden is making America poor. And in terms of your issue about the labor shortage, we just have to look, everybody believes in a safety net, but it's good for the country, it's good for the workers, it's good for American families that people are working. We did a study with Casey Mulligan at the beginning of, remember when you were starting to pay $600 a week additional, that was the Pelosi bill. a family with two parents and two kids with nobody working, with all of the benefits that you were providing, could make over $100,000 tax-free. That, you know who that was unfair to, Representative Moore? The people who were working. People who were working. The biggest mistake I think we made at the beginning of COVID, I talked to Donald Trump all the time about this. He was fully on board. We should have cut the payroll tax rather than, we should have rewarded the people who are working. Instead, what we always do is we were rewarding the people who weren't working. And you know what? Those people, the firefighters, the nurses, the people working in the nursing homes, the delivery people, the people in the grocery stores, those are the people we should have rewarded.
The same people, Stephen, that have to take a jab to keep their job now, the people who are working when there was no vaccine, right? But anyway, with that, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
Thank you. I recognize the lady from, oh, here she's coming up to be recognized. There you go. The lady from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses who are here today. I really appreciate all of your expertise. Obviously, we're witnessing one of the most significant self-owns in American history. The Biden regime has taken hardworking American patriotic people and pummeled them with hardship after hardship. And it's very difficult. The average annual cost of inflation on the middle class income is about $5,200, just under $450 a month. Consider what that means for a family of four making under $75,000. The average price of a gallon of gas is at a record highs and looks primed to soar even higher. And we've talked about a lot of these numbers already. And Mr. Moore, I'm really grateful that you are pointing out Congress's mistakes. I think that's why a lot of us are actually here, because we notice the mistakes that Congress makes, and we came here to try to do something about that. But you mentioned welfare. I would tag on to that, as I'm sure you have and do, the stimulus payments that were made, the checks to government employees who are at no risk for losing their jobs, never did lose their job. They've kept their job, were able to work from home, and then still got that. Then, of course, the unemployment benefits that you mentioned, just printing money. And thank you so much for bringing up the payroll tax. I'm a small business owner, and I almost think that that should be one of the qualifying things that we look at candidates who run to serve in the United States Congress. Have you ever signed the front of a paycheck? Because a lot of people don't understand what goes into that. And so cutting payroll tax would have been something that would have been amazing. But Joe Biden, on the other hand, often talks about Americans needing to continue to pay their fair share. Americans have been asked to spend thousands more each year effectively to subsidize the trillions of dollars in new spending undertaken by this administration. The federal government spent $7 trillion in 2020 alone. And Mr. Moore, you were in our budget committee hearing the other day when we were talking about the Build Back Better. It really would have been better off if he would have just left things the way they were. Don't touch anything, leave it alone. But if you ask the Democrat House Budget Chairman, John Yarmuth, he'd just tell you that we don't have to balance the checkbook. We're like the banker in Monopoly. We hand out the money and we create the money, and everybody else plays the game. And Americans have seen their paychecks thin out, their 401ks decimate, and they've seen energy prices skyrocket. We have the ability to unleash our full energy production here in America. And with that, I want to turn to you, Mr. Epstein. The Biden regime has claimed that there's nothing Joe Biden could have done to prevent today's gasoline prices. You've written that Joe Biden, had Joe Biden not spent the last year and a half opposing oil and instead spent his time liberating U.S. oil production and encouraging the rest of the world to do the same, gasoline prices would be far, far lower. Can you explain why, please?
Sure, thank you very much. Yeah, the argument that seems plausible is, oh, it's a global market, so we can't control it. So the obvious lie there is you can control the U.S. energy market, which is a huge market, but also you are the leader of the free world. Imagine Joe Biden had come into office in 2021 and said, hey, there's this dangerous anti-fossil fuel movement. As soon as we recover from this pandemic lockdown, there's going to be way more demand than supply. We need to reject the Paris Agreement. We need to stay out of it, and we need to tell others to get out of it. If you had opposed the global anti-fossil fuel movement, and encouraged energy freedom around the world, you would have had a proliferation of oil production, natural gas production, coal production, and you wouldn't have these problems at all. We'd be going through a global energy renaissance, not a global energy crisis. So Biden instead has been leading the world away from fossil fuels. He's been very aggressively pressuring nations to go away from fossil fuels. So he did the exact wrong thing, and he turned the opportunity for an energy renaissance into a global energy crisis.
Thank you. And Mr. Epstein, a follow-up. In May, Joe Biden canceled 3 sales amounting to millions of acres that would have been available for drilling. He hasn't even issued a single new lease sale to date, and we're still waiting on the new national program for the 2022 through 2027 period. A few weeks ago, the American Energy Alliance published a comprehensive list of 100 ways the Biden regime has made it more difficult to produce oil and gas. 32 of those occurred after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Do you think that the Biden regime's repeated attempts at deflection are convincing the American people?
Time has expired, but I'll let you answer.
I hope. I hope not, but I think the key is to make it really simple and say prices are set by supply and demand. The Biden administration restricted supply and encouraged the rest of the world to do the same, and that made prices go up by restricting supply while demand increases. And don't allow the people who caused this crisis to overcomplicate it or to distort it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Epstein. And Mr. Chairman, may I submit my other questions to Mr. Moore for a response later?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Bet. We'll now go to Mr. Good from Virginia, followed by Mr. Norman, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And these are two such critically important subjects, both the inflation as well as the energy crisis. First, I want to just ask Mr. Moore about inflation, then try to use the balance of my time on the energy side of it. You talked about the 4 recommendations that you made, one of which was 10 to 15% reduction in spending. Some of us are old enough to remember when you used to negotiate car prices. You didn't get your best deal unless you had walk-away leverage. You were willing to walk away to not make a deal to get the best possible deal. I would submit Congress needs to have that kind of courage, which is in short supply in Washington, even among the leadership of our own party. What would you say to how would we force in a majority Congress, if the American people give us a majority in the House and the Senate, to where we could pass legislation out of the houses that would reduce spending? How would you suggest we would force the president to sign legislation that actually reduces spending?
Well, that's a great question. I've lived through a number of Republican revolutions. I was there in 1995 when Newt Gingrich became Speaker. I was there in 2011 when the Republicans had won a huge majority. And one of the lessons I hope that you will learn when you re-enter the majority, and hopefully in large numbers, is Joe Biden cannot spend a single penny. Do you know that? He can't send a. You have a one-house veto. The Senate can't spend money. The only way the money can be spent is if you appropriate it in the House, and then the Senate appropriates it. So, I mean, take a hard line. You're going to have a voter mandate for less government. I think you're going to see a huge. I mean, Americans are fed up with the inflation. They're fed up with the excessive spending, and I'd like to see Republicans take a very, very tough line. And that's how, frankly, when we were negotiating with Bill Clinton, we took a tough line with him and went back and forth. But we passed 4 balanced budgets when Newt Gingrich was Speaker. Did you know that? That was the only time in the last 50 years because we took the hard line.
I would submit we've got to be willing to walk away and let the government shut down.
Well,
dare Biden to shut it down. The media's going to blame us anyway. We have to have the courage to do that. Many of us are on the board of the House Freedom Caucus, and we've actually signed a letter to McConnell and McCarthy that said we will not vote to fund any government funding that does not, at a minimum, secure the border, end the vaccine mandates, and unleash American energy again, even at a minimum, before we even evaluate the merits of any spending beyond that, which, of course, I agree with you, we need to cut by 10 to 15%. Moving to the energy piece of it with the limited time that I have, Mr. Epstein, I think you've done a wonderful job expressing the fact that we need to go on offense, stop accepting the left's premise about the the dishonest and dangerous demonization of fossil fuels. That is the big lie, that it hurts the country, that it hurts the planet for us to continue to develop fossil fuels. And as you and Ms. Sagama have pointed out, how we are actually the clean producers, and emissions are going down. We're producing cleaner energy than ever. But I would just ask, how can we reverse course? What kind of irreparable harm has been done to energy producers and industries like auto manufacturing with this stop and go? We had the relief on the Trump administration. Now we've got the shackles again by this administration. The fear that would come with a new administration. Hey, what's the long-term projection? Alex, you said that we need a congressional commitment to liberate domestic production. So Ms. Sagama, Mr. Epstein, with just a couple of moments left. But what would you say about what we can do to have a long-term commitment to this from a congressional standpoint?
Well, the first thing is to talk in those terms. So if you get power, it's how do you pass laws? And I think of this as we need an energy freedom platform. And I know I've talked to you about some of this. And I think 5 key planks are end preferences for unreliable electricity, decriminalize nuclear energy, liberate responsible development of American energy, practice pro-human federal lands management, and reduce emissions through liberating innovation, not punishing America. But it's really about making this a matter of law so that companies have that legal certainty. Right now, even if you get a better president and Congress, if you don't make things a matter of law, they're just going to fear the next election, and that is no environment for any business to operate under, let alone the long-term energy industry.
Which ties into Mr. Moore's, the fourth branch of government that's not elected, the bureaucrats. And Ms. Sagama, with just anything you would add to that?
I would agree. I mean, there's just such a whiplash from one administration to the other. We had some good rules put in place under President Trump, for example, reducing the timelines for the environmental analysis under NEPA, which affects all infrastructure projects. It was very limited to reduce the time, because the time to do NEPA can stretch to decades, and that just increases the cost of a road, a bridge, a pipeline, whatever. And so if Congress could pass laws that would actually limit what how these regulations were implemented, I think that would be very helpful. Otherwise, we're just going to whiplash from administration to administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now is the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, followed by Mr. Lamalfa.
And clear to all over, this hearing ought to be held on the Hill. Everybody should be interested in this. But let me ask you this, how do we get leaders to speak out? And Steve, you and I both had a front row seat on the infrastructure package, 1.5 trillion. It was the Republicans who gave them the 218. So we're a product of people that put all of us here. Now, Kathleen, how can we get the energy sector to speak up and to have hearings like this? It's insane what's going on. It is insane. And I'd ask all the panelists, unless we have an uprising of people getting their voice back, not just the leaders, but the donors, folks, I'm afraid even we get power, we're not going to know what to do with it. Help me out.
Doesn't seem to be working. There we go.
Yeah.
It is a bit discouraging on getting the message out, but I would suggest that this is one of the best times I've seen where people are actually understanding that policies are causing their energy prices to rise. Because in the past, they would just blame us for high energy prices, even though we are price takers, not price makers.
But how can we get your sector, your CEOs, to hold a conference and say, this is insane? We got
It's really difficult right now because of this woke capitalism. It's very hard for public companies to speak out right now. So I represent a combination of public companies and small independents, and the small independents don't have those same shackles, and they're definitely much more aggressive than, say, the larger companies. So you will see, for example, our comments along with U.S. Oil and Gas Association. We were very aggressive on the SEC rule, for example. A lot of companies couldn't speak out about that because they have activist shareholders even on their boards. So it can be difficult. And I would submit also any kind of public relations effort by the industry it's just so hard to overcome all the misinformation about climate change and environmentalism that is out there, that I'm certainly not financed to do it in my small organization. Again, we represent mostly small independents. It's kind of a tough nut to crack. But I think Alex has been kind of good at getting out some of that good information about fossil fuels that as well.
Maybe I'll comment for a second, but I want to hear what our former energy secretary has to say about the issue. So I think we have a real once in a lifetime opportunity right now, because the possibility of a global energy crisis, like the possibility of massive inflation, has not been on people's minds since the early 1980s, and people got away scot-free with these anti-fossil fuel, anti-energy policies, and now we're seeing them come to fruition. So it is very important to blame the people responsible for those of us who have been in the right to claim vindication, and then to put forward our own positive narrative. So it has to be pro-energy freedom, and that includes being pro-fossil fuels. And one key aspect is to tell everyone, hey, we need to look at the full context with fossil fuels. We need to look at the benefits and the side effects, not just look at the negative side effects. And when you give that message, people can see the amazing benefits of fossil fuels, not just for Americans, but for billions of people around the world. And I found that very effective myself. But I'd love to hear what Secretary Perry has to say.
Alex, I'll be brief. You're spot on. All three of these individuals who have testified here in front of you today, they understand the dynamic that's going on. And I think it's really important to understand what Alex just said about, we really haven't had any pain in this country since maybe back in, real pain by the energy side of things since maybe back in the 70s with the Carter administration. So kind of the wind at our back, the blue skies, the ain't it great to be an American, and oh yeah, we're for the climate and we're woke and we're all of this kind of cool stuff right now. It's not so cool now. It's not so cool when you can't put gas in your car. It's not so cool when you can't take care of your family. And that's got to be the message that, particularly those of you who are running for office, because you're going to be the dynamic of which decides what the direction that America is going to go in the future. And you've got to have the courage. And when you've got people like Alex, his book, and when you've got the industry that, finding the courageous people in the industry that will stand up and say, hey, we ain't interested in being woke. We're interested in taking care of the people in this country, or for that matter, the citizens of this world. And we have the moral argument on our side. We need to take it. We need to run with it. And I think we can be successful with it.
Well,
we can't be timid.
Only thing I'd say to all of you, y'all got influence. You're going to have to make the calls to Congress to force the issues. We the people again. Thank you so much.
Morning, Mr. Lamalfa, after which the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds.
Thank you to my good friend from Arizona for heading this up today, and to Heritage and all of our panelists. I appreciate this honest conversation on a very key topic. We watch as government is basically, in my home state as well as here federally, during the Biden administration especially, is just trying to price people out of the American dream, the American lives. They don't want single family housing. They don't want you in a car of your choice. They don't want you to do things that you're accustomed to and living in this way in this country. They just want you all in a tall building with walkable work and riding a bike. So, and the time we spent in our committees during this Democrat majority has been basically talking mostly about the racial makeup of federal agencies or climate change. I'm on the Ag Committee, and they're trying to apply it to how you till your soil. So it's really in a bad way. And the time we're losing right now due to ESG and such, as you've talked about, several of you, with the rigging of our financial system here to where people can no longer be part of traditional energy. They have to shift it all this way. They're going to continue to phase us out unless the Republican Congress that hopefully takes over in January and then a president in 24 can turn us back in a good direction. So that all said, we're watching the mistakes being made around the world. Germany got rid of most of their nukes, maybe all of them, decided to rely on Russian gas. Well, they see, hey, nobody could see that coming. So now they're going to have to turn their coal-fired plants back on. And so can't we learn lessons from this? Our own freight trains are not able to run because we don't have the workforce to run them ostensibly. So we're not getting the ethanol that we'd be making in California plants or shipped to California. Not that ethanol is the be all or end all. So let me focus it down onto a couple things. Lightning round with all of our panelists here. President Biden is talking about doing a tax holiday on gas at 18.4 and diesel at 24.4 cents to help save that amount on $5, $6 fuel. Also, my home state of California is resisting doing that, where California has approximately $1.30 of all taxes, including the federal bit in there. They refuse to even talk about it hardly, unless they want to give you a gas gift card that they'll even give to electric car owners. Tell me about the wisdom, all four of our panelists, real quickly, on what is, should we embrace the president's gas tax, diesel tax holiday when also at the same time we're running a massive federal deficit and it's not that big of a portion of the cost of fuel? How wise is that, Ms. Gohmert?
Well, I think we should really focus on just increasing production, just
Yeah.
get the government out of the way, because that's gonna, I mean, reducing your price at the pump by 18 cents is insignificant compared to what we could do if we actually unleashed American oil production.
Absolutely.
That's just what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Just one quick comment. The claim of this administration to want lower gasoline prices is at best a gigantic pretense and most likely a lie. Their goal from the beginning is to make fossil fuels unaffordable so you don't use them. And so everything needs to be focused on blaming the current global anti-fossil fuel movement, including this administration, for the problem and demanding that they reverse course in a systematic way. And I think all the focus needs to be on that, and do not allow them to blame industry, and don't allow them to do these ridiculous tiny measures that act like they care about the problem. They don't, they are the problem.
Lies upon lies. 94% capacity is what our refineries are running. That's what Biden's focusing on until he goes to Saudi Arabia. Secretary Perry, did you have a thought on this tax?
Yeah, this one is simple. Having been a chief executive of a fairly substantial entity back for about 14 years, the answer is no.
Thank you. Quickly, I want to remind everybody that carbon dioxide is 0.04% of our atmosphere. It's not 20 or 30, 40 or 50% like everybody thinks it is, as it's hyped. It's probably not even truly a greenhouse gas, except it was dubbed by that by EPA. Methane, other things, those are the problem gases. Plants dig it on CO2. And if we didn't have at least 200, plant life would die off. Let me make a point here, and you don't have to come back on it, but the supply of urea, which is mostly imported from Russia, China, and Qatar, is going to be very dire as Russia and China are cutting off those exports. Urea is important not only for fertilizer for farms, as I'm a farmer in real life, but also the production of the additive that goes in diesel for 20 and 10 new engines, that the DEF. We're going to run out of DEF. That means all the trucks and other equipment, farm equipment that needs that, they will not run without that. They will not run without this additive that keeps the exhaust cleaner. We're in dire straits if we don't have that stuff, and we're in great danger of running out because we don't have the urea to production in this country that used to be in the southern states to do that. We have to up the urea production so we can make this DEF and keep our engines running, unless we want to use our old trucks and tractors, et cetera. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, after which to Mr. Bishop.
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Cool socks. Appreciate that. Real quick, obviously we've talked a lot about energy and inflation. I'm going to go pretty quick. I think everybody around this table knows how we entered this inflationary cycle through the American Rescue Plan et al. Of the rest of the government spending that's occurred the last 24 months or so. Mr. Moore, one of the things that myself and a colleague of mine out of Arkansas, Mr. French Hill, are working on is a bill that would actually restore the Federal Reserve to a price stability mandate, getting rid of the employer mandate that the full employment mandate, that the Federal Reserve currently has. What is your opinion of returning the Federal Reserve to just a price stability mandate?
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I would favor some kind of a price rule. My good friend and one of my mentors, Steve Forbes, likes the idea of some kind of gold standard. I would look at maybe something a little broader than that. I like to look at commodity prices. By the way, if you look, you all should look every morning at what's happened to what's called the CRB index. That's an index of about 25 major commodities, everything from coal to cotton to copper to heating oil and so on and so forth. Straight up since Biden came into office. And so, yes, we should have I believe in a rule-based monetary policy. I also believe that at most we should, we want full employment in this country, obviously. But what really worries me, Congressman, the Federal Reserve is now making, carbon emissions and climate change one of their mandates. I mean, no wonder they can't control inflation. They've completely taken their eye off the ball.
That's exactly right. Real quick, Secretary Perry, good seeing you over there. I wanted you to comment quickly on the NRC. I actually was having a roundtable discussion with members of the nuclear community, both the large legacy reactors and then the new potential manufacturers of microreactors and small modulars. Can you tell the committee about the real problems that exist at the NRC and the dire need of reform so some of these new nuclear technologies can actually be deployed in the United States to help with our baseload energy issues that we do have?
Yes, sir. And I think that's where Congress could do some really good work, is to streamline the permitting process. And right now, you're not going to build a nuclear reactor, whether it's an old school one or whether it's a new advanced or a micro. It's just not going to happen because the mentality over there and the bureaucratic mess that is over at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission it's just not going to happen. So it's going to take Congress making that move. And here's the other side of it, is if states, and I hope there's some big states like my home state of Texas that will take the initiative here using the 10th Amendment and basically say we have the authority, because it doesn't say anything in the Constitution about whether or not we can do this type of work in our state. Texas would be a great place to try it and test it, from my opinion, because we have our own grid. And let the states take the lead on building these small modular reactors, working with some of their universities. I just think that that America needs to take the lead. Small modular reactors, these advanced reactors, micro reactors, that's the real future for energy production. And our fossil fuels will help us make that transition over the course of the years, but it should happen faster rather than later.
Okay, and to wrap up, Ms. Sigma, Mr. Epstein, can you talk about the issue we have currently, not only with the lack of pipeline development throughout the United States, but what, even in the big media, they're starting to talk about the real issue we have with a lack of oil refining capacity in the United States, and what do you think we need to be doing to rectify both of those situations?
Pipelines are, they're the infrastructure, they're the veins of the industry. I mean, we need the pipelines in order to put the natural gas so we can get it to Europe. We want to increase LNG to Europe, but we don't have the pipelines to get to the LNG terminals or to our allies in Asia. So that's one area I think Congress could consider when hopefully the House changes hands. On the go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, you go ahead.
On the refining issue, unfortunately, with 1.1 million barrels down a day capacity, that capacity is really not coming back. It's not like you can just flip a switch and approve, and bring that capacity back. So, the refining industry has been very hard hit by ESG, and it's very, companies are reluctant to invest in refineries if there's the possibility that an investment that's supposed to be for decades is suddenly going to be an asset that we don't need anymore. So they're very vulnerable, just as producers are, to this, this push to decapitalize the oil and gas industry.
Just very quickly, I think we need to recognize that the assault on American energy includes opposition to fossil fuel investment, fossil fuel production, fossil fuel processing, including refining, and fossil fuel transportation, including pipelines. And what I said about a long-term commitment by Congress, that needs to apply to all four of those aspects. What we're seeing is the energy industry is an incredible industry that provides energy for billions of people, hundreds of millions of Americans, but it takes freedom. And when you restrict freedom randomly, you don't think through the consequences, then you have these supply shortages, and you can't get rid of them by being upset because you're getting bad polls, which is the administration's basic response. They're upset not because they're upset about the consequences, but they don't like the polls. So we really need people in office who care about energy and are willing to make long-term commitments to liberate it.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your indulgence. I would argue this committee would get better ratings than that other committee that's going on right now. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I regret coming in late and missing a lot of what has been said, and so I start from, unfortunately, a difficult spot. I don't want to ask people to repeat themselves, but Secretary Perry, you know, you've had a great deal of experience in the public sphere as governor of Texas before being Secretary of Energy. I wonder, you know, what we see the Biden administration engaged in now as an attempt to sort of just the most remarkable blame game, blaming the Putin's invasion of Ukraine for all the price rise problems with the inflation problems that we have, what the American people are suffering. I happened to see a TikTok video on YouTube, not on YouTube, on Twitter yesterday evening, that it was someone who's obviously very left in their orientation, and she was screaming because of the gas prices and what it was costing her to fill her tank to get to her job, but she was screaming about the religious right wing over and over again. And, you know, it does seem to me, I know that there people are of differing levels of knowledge about politics and public affairs and so forth, and certainly economics is no easy feat for many of us. But in order to make the right decisions as Americans, we've got to diagnose our problems correctly, or the source of our problems correctly. And with the administration offering a lot of deflection and blame, I'm not sure will the American people get it, Secretary Perry? Maybe that's the big question. What is it that the American people need to understand in basic terms? Yeah, I do think the American people not only will get it, they're already getting it. When you see what's happening in my home state along the border with the historic Democrat voter who is Hispanic, who is now overwhelmingly coming to the Republican Party and going to vote for Republicans this November. At that particular point in time, the Biden administration is going to get it. They're going to get it real clearly. But when you start to see news outlets like CNN and even MSNBC to some degree start asking the appropriate questions about the capability, both intellectual and otherwise, of the Biden administration, particularly the president, then you know that the tide is about to turn. It's going to turn in a big way. Our job, I think, is just to continue to tell the truth. One of the reasons that I think that this book that Alex Epstein has got in front of you there, A Fossil Future, is so important is because it tells the truth. And I think as long as we will tell the truth, I think it's Ephesians that says to tell the truth with love, okay? And that's probably a good piece of advice as well. But to tell the truth day in and day out, the American people will be best served by that. And I think we will win the argument. And by doing that, America will be better served and the world will be better served, because with a strong America and a strong America energy sector, the world will be a better place to live. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And is it Ms. Sagama? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Skama, yes.
Skama. Specifically focusing on energy, Secretary Perry finished on that point,
I know that we hear two things of late from the Biden administration in sort of the blame campaign that has been ongoing. The one that sticks in my mind from the podium, White House podium last week was that oil companies should increase their production and that they're not patriotic if they don't, number one. And then I've heard a lot about price gouging. And the thing that strikes me, just as, again, not an expert in economics or in the production of energy or economic efficiency in energy, but is that it seems to me, I came of age in when President Reagan was in office, when we last had the Carter administration levels of inflation that President Reagan and Paul Volcker of the Federal Reserve slayed. I mean, they controlled inflation really for a life, all of my life. And I'm not a spring chicken. Why would anyone believe that that the desire to price gouge has suddenly appeared in 2021 after we've had prices under control or fairly level for 30, 40 years, 40 years?
Time has expired, but you can answer the question. Thank you.
Well, I didn't see anybody feeling bad for us when prices went negative in 2020. You know, that's all I have to say about that. But to your earlier question, the polling is good. The American people are understanding that their energy prices, as Alex was saying, they understand where the blame lies. And polling has been consistently 60% that the American people understand it would be better to increase production here than to decrease production for climate change reasons. 60% are consistently polling that they support more American production of oil and natural gas. So I do think that people are, most people, now your gal on TikTok, you know, she's probably one of that, you know, the 30% or 40% that, yeah, exactly.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I appreciate, again, all the members of Congress who've come and also our panelists. I have not asked questions, so I've saved myself for last, not because they're best, but I just wanted to make sure there was time for me to ask a few questions. And so I have some for each of you. And, you know, first of all, Ms. Sgama, President Biden claims that there are 9,000 oil and gas leases that have been approved that companies are simply not using. I won't tell you exactly what I have written down here what I think about that claim. I won't get there just for time's sake, but I want you to see, if you would, please explain the difference between a lease being approved and a company actually being able to drill and then actually bringing a hole to production.
Well, they've kind of been all over the place, leases, permits. I'll take the leases first. There are about 12,000 leases that are not producing right now out of something like 23,000 leases. And I would note that we're in court defending 5,900 of those leases. And it's really hard to produce on a lease if it's tied up in litigation. So that's one reason you might not produce on a lease. Another is you simply do some exploratory work, and there simply isn't economic quantities of oil and natural gas on that lease. So we never are in a situation where we produce on every single lease. And then another reason is the NEPA analysis takes so long on a lease that it's considered non-producing, even if it's in year 8 of the NEPA analysis. So that's another reason. And now, switching to the permit side, there are about 8,800 permits that have been approved but not used. There are also 4,500 permits that we have requested but that are being held up. And environmentalists just sued last week on 3,500 approved permits. So these were permits that the Biden administration actually approved, and they've sued on them because they don't want to see any production. So those are going to be tangled up, and it's going to be hard to develop on those permits. But one of the reasons that we don't drill all those permits is because you have to go out and get so many permits in hand when you want to develop federal wells, because you don't know how long that permit's going to take. The federal system is so inefficient that companies went out and they built up an inventory before the Biden administration came in because they were concerned that they would stop all permitting. And now there's litigation on permits. Now every single permit is going up to Washington, D.C. instead of being approved in the field. So there's so many inefficiencies in the system. Purposefully, yes.
Thank you for that. Secretary Perry, President Biden is talking about doubling the amount of ethanol as an additive as some way to reduce the price of gas. And so I guess my questions for you, will this increase the supply? What will be the impact on food production when you start burning food for fuel? And how good will this be for engines?
Yeah. These little nibbling around the edges are, and that's exactly what doing away with the gas tax, getting into the strategic petroleum reserve, increasing the amount of it. This is nibbling around the edge. If you want to make a difference in the price of gasoline, the only way that you can do it in a positive way to lower that is to increase production. That's it. Anything else that you're doing that's not producing production, you're just nibbling around the edges.
Right. I agree with that 100%. And then, Mr. Epstein, again, thank you for being here today as well. Thanks to all of you again. So we've talked a little bit about nuclear as a truly important cog to our energy development if we're going to be truly self-sustaining again. So there's science out there that professes to take the 96% of the nuclear fuel that is not used up in the process, and turning that and reforming it, reusing it, recycling it, repurposing it as a new fuel. Are you familiar with that emerging technology?
Yes, but I don't think it's the central issue.
Well, it's not the central issue because we won't even approve any nuclear reactor development, right? So that's the central issue.
Yeah. Can I just say a word on nuclear?
Yeah.
Because I'm known as pro-fossil fuels, but really I'm pro-energy and pro-global human flourishing, and that requires more of every form of cost-effective energy, certainly fossil fuels and also nuclear. So one thing I'm working on, and I invite anyone here, anyone listening to this who's in Congress to participate, is I think we need a new energy freedom platform, and a key plank needs to be decriminalize nuclear. So let me just very quickly give you some of the steps for this. We need to banish what's called the linear no threshold hypothesis, which is total pseudoscience that treats any amount of radiation as deadly, which makes no sense. We need to streamline the nuclear licensing process. I think it should take a maximum of 2 years, not 16 years or whatever it often takes. We need to prohibit anti-development activists from participating in the permitting process where they have no place being. We need to allow all cheap and safe forms of nuclear waste disposal, although current nuclear waste is quite safe. That's important. We need to eliminate all government discrimination against nuclear. We need to end all government preferences for unreliable electricity. And I think Secretary/Governor Perry said, and this is really important, the states should be able to take this over. So I think states should be able to opt out of the federal approval process and establish state approval processes. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the Nuclear Criminalization Commission. Since its advent in 1975, it has not approved from conception to completion one single nuclear plant and makes nuclear prohibitively expensive. You can't nibble around the edges there either. That needs fundamental reform or abolition. And so we really need nuclear decriminalization. It's not enough to subsidize or to say it's okay. We need to totally decriminalize it. And if anyone is interested, email me at alex@alexepstein.com. I'm very passionate about making this change when we get a new Congress and maybe a new president at some point.
Alex, repeat your email again, please.
Alex@alexepstein, EPSTEIN.com.
And there you have it. I thank Heritage for hosting us today. I thank everybody who's participated, the panelists, great information. Appreciate the members of Congress. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you,
ladies. Alex, well done. See you later.